Avoidants don't treat options better because they value them more. They do it because options don't threaten their nervous system. This is the part most people misunderstand. When someone is only an option, there is no emotional demand placed on the avoidant's internal world. There is no expectation of consistency, no pressure to show up emotionally, no requirement to stay present when feelings deepen. Options exist in a psychological gray zone where nothing has to be decided and nothing has to be sustained. And for an avoidant nervous system, that ambiguity feels calming. It allows them to engage without ever feeling exposed. There is interest without risk, attention without responsibility, and connection without vulnerability. That's why they can seem lighter, kinder, and even more attentive with people they are not choosing seriously. When real connection enters the picture, the experience inside their body changes completely. Real connection demands regulation. It requires emotional presence, attunement, and a willingness to tolerate intimacy without retreating. For someone with avoidant attachment, closeness doesn't register as safety. It registers as intrusion. Their nervous system interprets emotional depth as a loss of autonomy rather than a gain of connection. The more real you become, the more their internal alarms activate. This isn't conscious manipulation, it's a learned survival response shaped by early experiences where closeness came with pressure, disappointment, or emotional overwhelm. So when you activated attachment in them, you didn't create romance, you triggered threat. That's why the shift often feels so confusing from the outside. One moment they're engaged, curious, and warm. The next, they're distant, inconsistent, or emotionally unavailable. Nothing changed about your value. What changed was the level of emotional reality. Once you stopped being an option and started being a presence, their nervous system moved from ease into defense. Options don't require them to confront themselves. You did. And that confrontation feels dangerous to someone who learned that emotional closeness leads to discomfort, obligation, or loss of control. This is also why avoidants often appear more regulated with people they barely care about. With options, they can stay in performance mode. They can be charming without being vulnerable, attentive without being accountable, and connected without being seen. There is no fear of being needed, no risk of being relied upon. But with you, the stakes were real. Your presence mattered. Your expectations were felt, and that weight created internal pressure they didn't know how to process. So instead of leaning in, they pulled back, not because you were too much, but because the connection was too real. The hardest truth is that being the real choice often means being the one who activates their deepest fears. You didn't lose because you were replaceable. You were treated differently because you weren't. You crossed the line from safe distance into emotional proximity, and their nervous system responded the only way it knows how, by creating space. Options never threaten their autonomy. Real connection does. And until an avoidant learns how to regulate intimacy instead of escaping it, safety will always feel easier with people who don't truly matter. Avoidants don't struggle with connection because they struggle because real connection activates identity fear. With options, nothing about who they are gets questioned. They can stay flexible, undefined, and emotionally unaccountable. An option doesn't ask, who are you in intimacy? It doesn't reflect their emotional capacity back to them. It doesn't expose their limits, so they feel relaxed. But when you became real, when the connection moved beyond surface level interest, you stopped being just a person. You became a mirror. And mirrors are deeply uncomfortable for avoidance because they reveal what's missing, not just what's desired. Being chosen means being seen. And for an avoidant, being seen triggers a quiet panic around identity. Suddenly, they're not just someone dating or talking, they're someone who is expected to show up consistently, communicate emotionally, and hold space for another person's needs. That expectation doesn't feel neutral to them. It feels like pressure to become someone they're not sure they can be. So instead of feeling empowered by being chosen, they feel exposed. Options don't activate this fear because options don't demand a coherent self. They allow the avoidant to shift roles, disengage, or disappear without confronting who they are when closeness is required. This is why avoidants often look more confident and self-assured with people they aren't serious about. There's no internal reckoning happening. They don't have to ask themselves if they're capable of emotional depth, long-term consistency, or vulnerability. With you, those questions came up, even if they were never spoken out loud. And the moment an avoidant starts questioning their own emotional adequacy, shame follows. Not dramatic shame, but quiet internal discomfort. A sense of I'm not enough for this, or I'm going to fail here eventually. Distance becomes the solution to that discomfort. Pulling back isn't about losing interest. It's about escaping identity threat, because staying would require growth, and growth requires tolerating discomfort. Options don't require growth. They don't challenge the avoidant's self-image or force them to confront their emotional blind spots. You did, and that's why the connection felt heavier the deeper it got. Not because you were demanding, but because being real meant the avoidant could no longer hide from themselves. This is also why avoidants often say things like, I don't know what I want, or I'm not ready. What they're really saying is, I don't know who I am in this level of closeness. With options, they don't have to know. With you, not knowing felt destabilizing. So they retreat to where their identity feels intact, to low-stakes connections where nothing about them is questioned and nothing needs to be defined. The painful irony is that you represented potential growth, safety, and depth. But to an avoidant nervous system, growth feels like loss of control. So instead of leaning into the connection that could have changed them, they chose the familiarity of distance. Not because you asked for too much, but because you asked them to be someone they haven't learned how to be yet. Avoidants often appear to give their best to people who require the least, and this creates one of the most painful contradictions in avoidant dynamics. They show up on time for options, communicate clearly, and even seem emotionally available, not because those people are more important, but because nothing essential is at stake. When effort doesn't matter, it feels easy. There is no emotional consequence if they fail, no deeper meaning attached to their behavior, and no internal pressure to maintain consistency over time. Options allow avoidance to operate in a low-risk emotional environment, where effort is simply performance, not commitment. And performance is something they can control. With real connection, effort stops being neutral. Every action carries weight. A message isn't just a message anymore, it's reassurance. A plan isn't just a plan, it's reliability. Presence isn't just attention, it's attachment. For an avoidant nervous system, this shift is destabilizing. The moment effort becomes meaningful, it becomes threatening. Not because they don't care, but because caring turns effort into obligation. An obligation for avoidance is often unconsciously associated with emotional depletion, loss of autonomy, or being trapped in someone else's needs. This is why they may suddenly pull back, right when the connection deepens. It's not that they don't want to show up, it's that showing up now feels like it could cost them something internally. With options is no fear of being relied upon. No one expects them to be steady, emotionally present, or consistent. But with you, expectations formed naturally, not through demands, but through mutual connection. And expectations activate fear and avoidance because they learned early that expectations lead to pressure, disappointment, or failure. So they begin to ration their effort, not consciously, but instinctively. They respond slower, they initiate less, they keep conversations lighter, they avoid emotional depth. From the outside, it looks like they're giving less to the person who matters more. From the inside, they're trying to manage rising anxiety by reducing emotional exposure. Options don't trigger this response because there's nothing to lose if they disengage. You, however, represented something real, and real loss feels unbearable to someone who hasn't learned how to tolerate emotional risk. There's also a deeper layer here that often goes unseen. Avoidants equate effort with future responsibility. When they invest deeply, their nervous system jumps ahead to what that investment might demand long-term. Commitment, emotional labor, consistency, the idea of being needed. Even if you never asked for any of that explicitly, the internal association still forms. Options feel safe because they exist in the present moment only. Real connection feels like a future obligation. They don't feel equipped to handle. This is why avoidance can seem paradoxically generous with people they're not serious about. There is no inner voice saying, if I do this, I'll have to keep doing it. With you, that voice was loud, so they protected themselves by pulling back before effort turned into expectation, and expectation turned into pressure. It wasn't a lack of care, it was fear of what care would require. The most painful truth is that effort becomes difficult for avoidance, precisely when it matters most. You didn't lose because you weren't worth the effort. You lost because being effortful with you meant admitting the connection was real. And for someone whose nervous system equates real connection with danger, distance feels like relief, even when it costs them something meaningful. Avoidants keep options because options protect them from the one experience they fear most, loss. And when someone remains only partially chosen, the avoidant never has to fully risk their heart, their identity, or their emotional stability. Options act as a buffer against vulnerability. They create the illusion of connection without the exposure of commitment. As long as nothing is fully decided, nothing can fully be taken away. And for an avoidant nervous system that associates closeness with pain, this feels like control. Choosing one person fully means opening the door to grief, regret, and emotional consequence. It means admitting this matters. And once something matters, the possibility of loss becomes real. Avoidants are often not afraid of love itself. They are afraid of the emotional aftermath if love fails. Many learned early that closeness comes with disappointment or abandonment. So instead of risking that pain again, they manage it preemptively by never fully choosing options. Allow them to stay emotionally insured. If one connection gets too close, another exists to diffuse the intensity. This is why avoidants often appear calm during distance and unsettled during intimacy. Distance reduces the risk of emotional collapse. Intimacy amplifies it by spreading their emotional investment across options. They prevent any single connection from becoming powerful enough to hurt them deeply. This isn't strategic dating behavior, it's emotional self-preservation. They're not avoiding you. They're avoiding the vulnerability that choosing you would require. Ironically, the strategy creates the very outcome they fear. By refusing to choose fully, they lose the chance to build safety through consistency. By avoiding emotional risk, they guarantee emotional emptiness. Loss doesn't disappear, it just gets delayed and internalized. They don't experience the sharp pain of heartbreak, they experience a dull, lingering sense of something missing. And that emptiness often surfaces later when distance finally feels hollow instead of safe. There's also an unspoken belief operating beneath this behavior. If I never fully invest, I can't fully fail. Options protect their self-image. If a relationship ends, they can tell themselves it was never that serious. That narrative shields them from shame and grief, but it also prevents healing. Choosing you would have required courage, not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that tolerates uncertainty and emotional exposure. And that kind of courage hasn't been developed yet. This is why avoidance may look unaffected after pulling away. The impact doesn't hit immediately, it comes later, in moments of stillness, when options lose their appeal and emotional distance stops feeling like freedom. That's when the loss finally registers, not as heartbreak, but as regret. Not as longing for you specifically, but as the recognition that safety was mistaken for fulfillment. You didn't ask for too much. You represented something that required emotional bravery. And until an avoidant learns that vulnerability doesn't equal devastation, options will always feel safer than the one connection that could have changed them. As the connection deepens, avoidants don't feel more secure, they feel more exposed. Real choice activates a layer of shame that options never touch. When you became emotionally present, consistent, and invested, the avoidant didn't feel empowered by your care. They felt inadequate. Your availability highlighted the gaps in their own emotional capacity, not in an accusatory way, but in a quiet, internal comparison they never asked for. Options don't reflect anything back. You did, and what was reflected made them uncomfortable. Avoidant shame isn't loud or dramatic. It doesn't show up as guilt or apology. It shows up as withdrawal. It's the sense of I can't give what this requires, or I'm going to disappoint them eventually. That belief doesn't come from you. It comes from years of internalized experiences where closeness led to pressure or failure. So instead of staying and confronting that fear, They create distance to restore their sense of competence. Distance allows them to feel capable again. Options never threaten their self-esteem because nothing meaningful is expected of them. This is why avoidants often say they feel pressure without being able to explain where it's coming from. The pressure isn't about demands, it's about being seen clearly. When someone truly knows them, their emotional blind spots become harder to ignore. With options, they can stay in a curated version of themselves, interesting, detached, in control. With you, that version started to crack, and shame fills the space where control slips. There's also a deep fear of being exposed as emotionally deficient. Avoidants often carry an unspoken belief that others are better at intimacy than they are. So when someone like you stays, cares, and remains emotionally open, it creates a painful contrast. Your consistency becomes a reminder of what they struggle to provide. Instead of motivating growth, that contrast triggers retreat. Pulling away protects their self-image. It allows them to leave before being found out. This is why they may suddenly become critical, distant, or emotionally cold. It's not because they stopped caring. It's because caring activated self-judgment. Options don't elicit that response because options don't matter to activate internal standards. You did. The closer you got, the more they felt like they were failing you, even if you never said a word. The tragedy is that this shame keeps avoidance stuck. By leaving, they reinforce the belief that they can't handle closeness. By choosing options, they avoid the very experiences that would help them grow. You didn't represent a burden, you represented a mirror. And for someone who learned to survive by looking away, being seen feels more dangerous than being alone. They didn't pull back because you weren't enough. They pulled back because you were too real to ignore, and staying would have required them to confront parts of themselves they've been avoiding for a long time. Avoidance feels safest when they control the pace, the distance, and the emotional access. Options give them that control effortlessly. They decide when to engage, when to pull back, and when to disappear without explanation. There is no emotional consequence for inconsistency because nothing has been defined. Control keeps their nervous system regulated, but real connection changes the power dynamic. When emotions are mutual, control is no longer one-sided, and that loss of control is deeply unsettling for an avoidant. With you, the connection became reciprocal. Your presence mattered, your responses mattered, your absence would be felt, and that reality removes the illusion that they are fully in charge. Emotional reciprocity equalizes power, and equal power feels unsafe to someone who learned that closeness leads to vulnerability. So when they sense that they can no longer manage the connection on their own terms, their instinct is to create distance, not to punish, but to stabilize themselves internally. This is why avoidants often retreat right after moments of closeness. A deep conversation, emotional intimacy, or mutual vulnerability can feel grounding in the moment and overwhelming afterward. Their nervous system swings from connection to alarm. Pulling back restores a sense of control. Options don't create this swing because nothing emotionally destabilizing is happening. There's no risk of being affected by another person's feeling. Control also protects them from accountability. In undefined connections, they aren't responsible for how their behavior impacts someone else. But with you, accountability naturally emerged. Not because you demanded it, but because emotional bonds create responsibility. And responsibility feels heavy to someone who equates it with emotional exhaustion or loss of freedom. Distance becomes a way to escape that weight. There's an important distinction here. Avoidants don't seek control because they want power over others. They seek control because they don't feel safe when they don't have it. Control is how they self-regulate. It's how they avoid emotional overwhelm. Options keep that regulation intact. Real connection threatens it. This is also why attempts to talk it through often backfire with avoidance. Conversations about feelings, expectations, or clarity remove their ability to manage distance quietly. They feel cornered, not because you're aggressive, but because ambiguity is being replaced with definition, and definition removes their perceived escape routes. The irony is that control doesn't bring peace, it brings isolation. By constantly managing distance, avoidants prevent the very co-regulation that could soothe their nervous system long term. But until they learn that intimacy doesn't equal loss of self, control will always feel safer than closeness. You weren't asking for power, you were asking for connection. But to an avoidant, connection feels like surrender, so they retreat to where they feel most stable in relationships, where they hold all the control, and nothing meaningful is at risk. For avoidance, the difference between you and an option is not attraction, it's finality. You represented a real decision. Options represent exits. When a connection stays undefined, it keeps every door open. There's always an escape route, a reason not to commit, a way to leave without confronting the emotional weight of leaving. That openness feels like freedom to an avoidant nervous system. But when you became real, the doors started to close. And that's when panic sets in. Avoidants don't fear love in the way people assume. They fear permanence. Permanence implies continuity, expectation, and emotional presence over time. It suggests a future where they are emotionally involved, seen, and relied upon. Even if you never spoke about long-term plans, the emotional bond itself hinted at continuity. And for someone who learned to associate closeness with loss of autonomy, continuity feels like entrapment. Options don't suggest a future. They exist in fragments of the present. That's why they feel lighter. This is why avoidants often say things like, I just want to see where things go, or I don't want labels. These aren't casual preferences, they're defenses against finality. Labels close doors, decisions close exit. Choosing you fully would have meant letting go of the psychological safety net that options provide. And that safety net isn't about other people. It's about preserving their ability to run when emotions become overwhelming. There's also a deep fear of making the wrong choice. Avoidants often believe that choosing incorrectly will trap them in regret, so they delay choosing at all. Options allow them to postpone responsibility for their own happiness. As long as nothing is finalized, nothing can be blamed on them. Commitment forces accountability, not just to another person, but to themselves. And that accountability feels risky. The tragedy is that by avoiding finality, avoidance remains stuck in emotional limbo. They never fully arrive, but they never fully leave. They move from option to option, mistaking movement for freedom. But freedom without depth, depthly becomes emptiness. The exits they protect so carefully become the very reason nothing ever lasts. You felt heavy to them not because you were burdensome, but because you represented meaning. Meaning requires choice. Choice requires courage. And courage is hard for someone whose nervous system equates attachment with danger. So they choose the path that feels safest in the moment, the one where no door ever fully closes. You weren't asking them to give up their freedom. You were offering something real. But to an avoidant who hasn't learned how to stay, a real connection feels like a point of no return. And until they learn that choosing doesn't mean losing themselves, options will always feel easier than committing to the one thing that could have changed their life. The hardest truth in avoidant dynamics is this. They didn't treat options better because those people mattered more. They treated them better because those connections mattered less. Options were safe precisely because they were expendable. There was no emotional risk, no internal pressure, and no fear of loss. The avoidant could show up generously because nothing about those interactions threatened their sense of stability. You, on the other hand, weren't expendable. And that's exactly why the behavior changed. When someone doesn't matter, there is nothing to protect. The avoidant can be attentive, playful, and consistent without fear of emotional consequence. But when someone does matter, the stakes rise. Every interaction feels heavier. Every moment of closeness carries the risk of attachment. And attachment to an avoidant nervous system feels like exposure. So instead of leaning in, they subconsciously begin to create distance. Not because they don't care, but because caring feels unsafe. This is where most people internalize the wrong narrative. They assume they were replaced by someone better, easier, or more attractive. But what actually happened is that the avoidant retreated to relationships that didn't require growth. Options don't ask for emotional bravery. They don't challenge attachment patterns. They don't demand self-reflection. You did. And growth often feels threatening to someone who learned to survive by staying emotionally self-contained. There's also a delayed emotional reckoning that rarely gets talked about. Avoidants often feel relief immediately after pulling away. Their nervous system calms, the pressure lifts, they tell themselves they made the right choice. But that relief is temporary. Over time, the absence of depth starts to register. Options lose their novelty. Emotional distance begins to feel empty rather than safe. And that's when the truth surfaces, not as longing for you specifically, but as the realization that something meaningful was avoided, not resolved. You don't need to return for this realization to happen. Your absence does the work. When you stop offering emotional availability, you remove the contrast that allowed them to stay comfortable, and in that quiet space, the avoided feelings eventually rise. Regret doesn't always show up as a dramatic return. Sometimes it shows up as restlessness, dissatisfaction, or the sense that something important was lost without ever being fully understood. You weren't treated as an option. You were treated as a threat, not to their freedom, but to their avoidance. And that distinction matters because it means the problem was never your worth, your effort, or your presence. The problem was that real connection asked them to become someone they weren't ready to be. Options didn't win. Avoidance did, and until that pattern changes, the same cycle will repeat. Different faces, same distance, same quiet loss.